Hello and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, a virtual welcome here in Washington, D.C. My name is Christopher Sands and I'm director of the Canada Institute here at the Wilson Center. And the Canada Institute has brought together an all-star panel to talk about Canada's 44th federal election, which occurred on Monday, September the 20th. That election has gotten some news coverage in the United States, but always to the top line. What was the result? Is there a new prime minister? But as in every election, there's a lot going on beneath the surface. What are Canadians thinking? What does the election tell us about the mood in the country? And what issues matter to individual Canadians? And I think for those of us who live outside Canada, the election also has some message as to what we can expect from Canada in global affairs and on major issues. I want to introduce our panel moving from east to west as the results came in the same order. We have with us a really distinguished group, starting with Daryl Dexter. Daryl Dexter is a former premier of the province of Nova Scotia, a member of the New Democratic Party, and now is vice chair of Global Public Affairs, a strategic advisory company. You'll hear that name again as we proceed. Moving to the west now, we also have Frédéric Gagnon, professor of political science. He is the Raoul Dandurand Chair at the University of Quebec at Montreal. He also runs an observatory on the United States. And so he's a keen observer of US politics. And I will look to him for some trends and maybe some comparative look at the Canada-US mood. We then come to Monique Smith. Monique Smith is a former member of the Ontario cabinet. She's a former chief of staff to the Premier of Ontario, and we got to know her well when she was Ontario's representative here in Washington, D.C. She also knows both countries very, very well. Nice to have you here with us, Monique.
Thanks,
Then
Chris.
we have, you're welcome. Then we have Lauren Stone. Lauren Stone is and I should have mentioned, apologies, Monique Smith is also a senior Canada-US counselor for Global Public Affairs. Lauren Stone is also with Global Public Affairs. She comes to us from Manitoba, where she has worked with conservative politicians, including the now former Premier of Manitoba, Brian Pallister, and she is also with Global Public Affairs. Welcome, Lauren. And then moving just a little bit further west, we have Randy Pettipa. And Randy is a former Prime Minister's office staffer for Liberal Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. He comes to us from Calgary, and he is the president of Global Public Affairs and a good friend of us at the Wilson Center. And for full disclosure, Global Public Affairs is a supporter of the Canada Institute, and Randy's a member of our advisory board. So I look to him for advice, not only on what's going on in Calgary and Canadian elections, but just about everything else as well. Moving to our furthest west, we have Edward Ted Alden, who is known to many. He's a Council on Foreign Relations Fellow, and he is the Ross Chair at the College of Business and Economics at Western Washington University. He's actually an original British Columbian, and so while he's on the American side of the line at the moment, I think he is someone who knows BC politics well, and I think will give us a sense of the mood in the Cascadia part of North America. So with no further ado, I would like to start with Premier Dexter. And Premier, tell us, how did the election look in Atlantic Canada, and what did you take away from what we saw on Monday?
Well, I think it's good to start maybe with what the kind of overall narrative was for that election, and it really at the beginning of the campaign, everybody virtually to a person was saying that it was an unwanted and unnecessary campaign. And those who follow elections will know that that's a frequent thing that gets said at the beginning of campaigns. But usually after a couple of days, that argument just disappears and everybody gets on with, what's on offer and, which party is kind of creating momentum. That and there were other factors that happened during the campaign. But that narrative stuck around, and it stuck around throughout the entire campaign. And you heard it almost as much at the end of the campaign as you did at the beginning. And lo and behold, the people of Canada decided that they were just going to send the same parliament back to the House of Commons. And they did that almost exactly, just proving the point that it was an unnecessary and unwanted campaign. So I would say that none of the parties really got what they wanted out of that election. Not much progress was made by the opposition parties, and no real progress was made by the government in terms of solidifying a minority. The government went in with what was perceived considerable leads in polling. All political operatives will do what is expedient when it comes to these kinds of things, but and you'll have to decide yourself whether or not expediency equates with cynicism. But nonetheless, that's kind of what happened. In Atlantic Canada, like much of the rest of the country, there wasn't a lot of change. The Conservatives did manage to pick up some seats in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. For us, importantly, the Minister of Fisheries was defeated in Nova Scotia. So we lost the one cabinet minister that was in the former Trudeau cabinet. So the question here now turns to who from the remaining members of Parliament are likely to go into cabinet, and that's important. Canada operates on a lieutenant system, so the cabinet minister from Nova Scotia kind of operates like the local lieutenant for the prime minister in the province. So there's a lot of speculation about that. And from a process perspective, the other thing is, is there going to be some ministerial and departmental reorganization? Of importance to Atlantic Canada would be, for example, that the Atlantic Canada Opportunity Agency, which is currently part of the portfolio of a minister from Central Canada, would actually come back to the Maritime. So that's an important discussion for this region. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Premier Dexter. And now we turn to Frédéric Gagnon.
Yeah, so I watched election night in Montreal, and I was looking at the results. And at some point, I came to the conclusion that you might want to dub this election a copy-paste election, because the results were very, very similar to the ones we saw in 2019. Or if you like sci-fi movies, I guess you can call this election the Back to the Future election. You're Marty McFly on the DeLorean driving back in time to 2019, sitting on the couch and watching the results, and they're pretty similar to the ones we saw Monday. So when it comes to Quebec, if you look at the results in the province of Quebec, there are 78 districts or ridings in the province of Quebec. And just like Daryl said, and in other provinces as well, we saw the same kind of stability in the province of Quebec. Only 2 ridings flipped from one party to the other. So 78 ridings in total. And the 2 ridings that flipped are Châteauguay-Lacolle and Brome-Missisquoi. The Liberals had these districts before, and they flipped to the Bloc Québécois. So all in all, in the province of Quebec, you didn't see many changes. The Bloc Québécois is the party that got the most seats with 34. They had 32 in 2000 after 2019. The Liberals lost 2, so they have 33 now. The Conservatives didn't win any seats. They didn't make any gains in Quebec, and the NDP didn't make any gains in Quebec as well. So Alexandre Boulris is elected in Rosemont on the island of Montreal, is the only elected official from the NDP in the province of Quebec. The NDP wanted to make gains in the province. Ruth-Hélène Brousseau almost won one of the elections there, but all in all, a copy-paste election in Quebec. And I was born in the region of Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean in the province of Quebec. I don't know if you know this region, but 25 years ago, we had a flood in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean. You can look at the images on YouTube. And when I was watching the election, I thought about this little white house in Saguenay, surrounded by water, flood, and the only house that was left standing. And this election felt a little bit like it, because in 2019, it was pre-COVID-19, all the debates we've had on masks, on vaccines, the election of Joe Biden in the States. So a flood of events, but the results are very similar to the ones you saw in 2019. So this election feels a bit like the little White House that stayed there while there was a flood of events around it.
Oh dear, that sounds a little bit like our big White House in Washington, surrounded by a flood of events. Thank you for that image, Frederic. Monique Smith. Oh, you're on mute, Monique. I'm sorry. Oh, yes.
A year and a half in, you'd think we'd all know how to unmute. Sorry.
No, that's all right.
I'm gonna quote a reporter from Quebec, Chantal Hébert, who said on one of the casts the other night, this was an election that no one wanted, and no one got what they wanted. I think that kind of covered it all for me, from my perspective. In Canada, we have 338 districts. Ontario is considered vote rich because we have 121 of those districts in Ontario. And just to show you how much the world did not change, the Liberals went down 1 seat in Ontario. The Conservatives went up 1 seat in Ontario. The NDP went down 1 seat, and the Greens went up 1 seat. So it's a pretty mirror image of what was there before. That doesn't reflect the popular vote. With the popular vote, the Liberals had gone down about 3%, and the Conservatives were up about 2%. But as many commentators have stated about the Ontario vote and the Liberal vote countrywide, it was very efficient. They got their votes where they needed them to get the seats. The final result in Ontario was the Liberals had 78 seats, the PCs 37, the NDP 5, and the Green 1. And these are important for a couple of reasons. It explains a little, for some people anyway, it explains why the Conservatives didn't win across the country. They were actually picking up a little bit of steam as we came across the east, and then flailed in Ontario, where they were hoping to break into what we call the 905, which is all of the districts around Toronto, which is the 416. The 416 solidly Liberal. The 905 does shift back and forth from time to time. This time stayed pretty much solidly Liberal. The NDP were hoping to pick up some seats in some urban areas in Ottawa, in Hamilton, up north, and failed to do that. And the Green Party, some argue, had a breakthrough victory with 1 seat in Ontario, in Kitchener. However, you have to put a little asterisk beside that win, because it was a riding where the Liberal candidate got dropped in the middle of the election campaign. And so it became a 3-way race, but without a Liberal. So the Greens were able to pick that up. The Greens also had a notable event in Ontario where their leader, who was running in a very strongly held Liberal riding, unfortunately, came in 4th. One could argue that her days of leadership are numbered. And if you were paying any attention to the campaign, her days have been numbered for a while. It was a very unfortunate ride for Annie Paul, and a very untimely time for the Green Party to kind of tank across the country. And we can get into that a little bit more when we do a broader analysis. In Ontario, the Liberals lost 2 cabinet ministers, unfortunately 2 female cabinet ministers. But they did, make a few gains here and there. Aaron O'Toole, I'd say, was had a big loss in Ontario, in that he really pulled the Conservative Party to the left in order to try and attract those votes in 905, and failed to do that. So his change in position may put his leadership in jeopardy in the future, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later, Chris. But I think that there's a lot of what happened in Ontario that has consequences for Aaron O'Toole and the Conservative Party moving forward. One more note I just want to touch on is the presence of the People's Party of Canada, led by Maxime Bernier, who is a French from Quebec politician, seen as a fringe party, seen as the kind of radical right, certainly adopted some Trump-like tendencies during the campaign. But they were very much a vote splitter in Ontario, where we had Conservative candidates who failed to make gains because, in many cases, the correlation is between the numbers of the PPC going up and the numbers of the Conservatives either staying the same or going down. So where they might have made some gains, that was pulled from them by the PPC, but the PPC failed to be elected anywhere in the country. They were just spoilers in a number of ridings where you can kind of do that math pretty easily. So I'm going to leave it there. There are some things moving forward. Ontario has an election next year. So at a provincial level, this federal election could have some impact, and there could be some reading of the tea leaves at the provincial level after Monday, but we can get into that later as well. And I'll hand it over to Lauren, my friend to the west.
Over to you, Lauren. How do things look from Manitoba?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris, and thanks for the Institute for including me in this panel today. So Manitoba, it's a small province, often a forgotten province. We only have about 1.3 million people, and 55% of our population is really centered in the city of Winnipeg, with the remaining in small rural towns scattered throughout the province. So, you know, historically, there's a pretty high concentration of conservative support rurally, but the center of Winnipeg is a bit different and a bit of a dog's breakfast. We have a few Liberal safe seats, we have a few NDP safe seats, and then a couple conservative safe seats as well. So, you know, over the past 6 weeks of the campaign, similar to what we saw in the other regions, it was essentially a remake of the 2019 election. We had 13 out of 14 candidates that held their seat and are incumbents. There is a seat right now that's up for grabs, and they're currently counting their mail-in ballots today as we speak. I think it's within about 100 votes between the Liberals and Conservatives. And what's unique about that riding is it's half rural and half city of Winnipeg, so it crosses that city perimeter. So that will be an interesting one to continue to watch over the next couple of days. You know, throughout the campaign, and Monique touched on this as well, the PPC made a lot of gains in Manitoba, but in particular in the rural conservative safe seats. You know, as O'Toole kind of shifted more to the center, hopes he would make some gains within some of those Liberal ridings, not just in Ontario, but the Liberal ridings in the city of Winnipeg as well. But what ended up happening was that gave a perfect tailwind storm to the People's Party of Canada for rural Manitoba. You know, so he was unsuccessful in those city more progressive ridings, but it certainly did bleed support from the Conservatives in our rural conservative ridings. You know, prairie voters, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, they often kind of latch on to whichever party taps into kind of a sense of frustration with the establishment. You know, as I mentioned, we are kind of the forgotten provinces of Canada since we're pretty small. So, you know, whether that's the sense of feeling like they're cash cows to Eastern Canada, or just a sense of feeling ignored. And so the People's Party of Canada truly tapped into that in our rural ridings. And it's going to be just an interesting movement to watch over the next couple of years, in particular if we have another election in 18 months. You know, if COVID and restrictions continue, then you can certainly see them continue to build their support base across rural Manitoba. And, you know, just to give a bit of reference, in the riding that I live in, I live just outside of Winnipeg, and a, you know, true blue conservative safe seat held by a lady by the name of Candace Bergen, who also happens to be deputy leader to O'Toole. Well, she generally wins about 80% of support within the riding. This time around, she won 53%, and the People's Party of Canada took 21%. You know, so that certainly tells me that, you know, this riding in particular, and what we saw kind of across the Manitoba rural ridings, is that movement continuing to grow. But like I said, you know, we'll see what happens. The PPC ran on a very kind of one message, the freedom movement, anti-restriction, anti-mask, anti-vaccine mandates. So if COVID is not as much of a concern in the next election, then you could start to see them fizzle out, but really time will tell. But, you know, so that's kind of Manitoba, similar to the rest of the regions, status quo from 2019, with the exception of this one riding that we're waiting on.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And now a little bit further west to Randy Pettipa in Alberta. Randy. You're still muted as well. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Monique had taught me how to do this. Alberta's where it was a little more exciting, I guess. Now, I should say through the Alberta, it's 34 seats, and I'm sure most people in this call are kind of where it is, and it is a province that has historically been very, very dependent on oil and gas. Morphing out of that a little bit now, but it is still sort of the mainstay of Alberta. So many issues revolve around that industry. I would say, though, that during the campaign, and I'll come to results, but Alberta's also in a COVID crisis right now. I think of all the provinces in Canada, it's having the toughest go right now in terms of ICU admissions and all. So the focus on the federal campaign wasn't what it usually would be in Alberta. Now, that said, it definitely influenced outcomes in Alberta. And the Premier Kenny, was taking definitely some hits, as any leader would when you're in a health crisis in a province. And I would say that affected the federal vote. Yes, the PPC did, but, and Lauren, I was surprised, 21%. That might be the most in the country for any riding. I don't know, but that's really significant. We haven't seen that in Alberta. I think overall it was kind of 9% or 7% for the PPC, but the Conservative vote did drop 14 points in Alberta. And I think that's probably an overlap from all kinds of other things that were happening, but it did create some change. We went into this campaign with, out of 34 seats, 33 were Liberal. One was NDP, and it's one that is usually NDP, and more often than not, it's a very, very conservative province. But depending on how a couple of which will be recounts and currently are counting mail-in ballots, there are 4 non-conservative ridings. The Liberals won one in Calgary, and that one will stick for sure. That was a significant win. And in Edmonton, you've got one Liberal who is leading right now, but I think by just over 100 votes. So similar to the situation Lauren talked about in Winnipeg, that could go either way. But the NDP definitely have 2. So that is that doesn't sound like much. Let me tell you, from a guy sitting in Calgary, that's pretty monumental change, and based on what we've had sort of historically. And it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. Obviously, the province of Alberta had no one at the cabinet table in the last government, and they will have at least one person, possibly 2 this time. So I think as much as, all the Liberal votes are pretty concentrated in those areas that won. So you still have a lot of unhappy voters based on the overall national outcome. But I would say that just having a seat at the table is something that Albertans are, particularly in the oil and gas sector, are actually looking forward to. And I don't think I have much to add to that. Other than, Chris, I have some other comments that I'll save for, because I think they'll come up in questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Randy. And now we go to our furthest west participant, Ted Alden. What was going on in British Columbia?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. Yeah, this feels exactly like being in British Columbia on an election night, which is everything is done and dusted by the time it gets out here before a single vote is counted. So this election was very typical in that regard. BC made no difference at all in the overall outcome. There were some interesting things about the results. I think, the geographic divides were much what they have been. The NDP doing very well on Vancouver Island and up in the northern parts of the province. The Conservatives doing well in the outer Vancouver suburbs and up to the Alberta border, the interior part of the province. The Liberals, though, did surprisingly well in the Vancouver area this year. I think we'll see when all the votes are counted, but it looks like the Liberals are going to have gained 4 seats, and several of those were in the suburban areas, Richmond, Langley, Cloverdale, areas outside of Vancouver. The suggestion is some of this has to do with Vancouver's extraordinarily high housing prices. Young people are getting pushed more and more away from the city out into the suburbs, and the political complexion of the suburbs is starting to change in ways that may have benefited the Liberals and harmed the Conservatives a bit. So it was not a great election for Aaron O'Toole here in British Columbia. I think much like Monique commented on in Ontario, I think the hope was that his moving to the left on some issues like climate change would help in the Vancouver suburbs. Does not seem to have done that. The Liberals did very well there. Second thing, just briefly, what this kind of means in the provincial political context. I think, if you look at what happened in BC here last fall, John Horgan was a bit of a model for Justin Trudeau, Horgan, the NDP premier out here, called a similar snap election in the fall. He had a rather precarious minority, more precarious than Trudeau's, relying on support from a couple of Green party members. He had hoped and was successful in using his response to the pandemic to gain a majority government. I think there was a lot of confidence in British Columbia and his response. Bonnie Henry, the chief health officer, was a popular figure out here. He used that very successfully, despite complaints. What are you doing calling an election in the midst of a pandemic? Did quite well. I think he partly got lucky. The virus that fall was waning. Before we saw the big second wave in the early part of 2021. Trudeau was less lucky with the Delta virus surge. I think for Horgan, this is a pretty good outcome. He's worked very well with federal Liberals. In fact, he was criticized a little for not supporting Jagmeet Singh, the NDP leader, enthusiastically enough during the campaign. But I think Horgan's priorities, particularly climate change and infrastructure in the Vancouver area, fit pretty well with Trudeau. So I think that'll be a comfortable relationship. Just one last thing I want to bring in, since you and I, Chris, are here on the U.S. side of the border, me in Washington State, you in the other Washington. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with U.S.-Canada relations after this election. The actions this week by the Biden administration, I think, were a bit of shock to Canada. Under a lot of pressure from the Europeans, the U.S. has now announced it's lifting the travel ban for vaccinated Europeans as of early November, and others too. China, India, other places, vaccinated travelers are going to be able to start coming back to the United States. But that very same day, the administration announces another month-long extension of no non-essential Canadians allowed to drive across that land border. And I don't think any of us sort of believed Canada would somehow find itself at the back of the line when it came to easing the COVID travel restrictions. And I think some of this is just a real neglect we've seen in the relationship under COVID. Both Canada and the United States have been very domestically focused. I think in Canada, certainly there was a lot of anger about how the pandemic was handled here during the Trump administration. I think there's a lot of lingering bad feelings carried over from the Trump days. So I do think one of the challenges for the Trudeau government now will be to try to rebuild and strengthen the Canada-U.S. relationship, which is, still, I think, fundamentally strong. You talk about this a lot, Chris, but I think there are some bigger irritants and shaky points at the moment than we've seen in quite a while.
Absolutely. And Ted, it was notable that although the U.S. didn't restrict flights during the border restrictions, we were still allowed to fly down. In a way, just the new testing requirement that was added for China, for Europe, all will actually make it slightly another hurdle for Canadians flying. So if anything, it actually made things tighter for Canadians, and the land border, as you say, not affected at all. Two things. First, thanks to the first round of great commentaries. Second, those of you who are watching this live, as opposed to the recording, can ask a question of any of our panelists, and there are two ways to do it. One, send us an email at Canada@wilsoncenter, all one word, .org. And if you're writing in from Canada, we spell center with an ER, American style. So Canada@wilsoncenter.org, or you can tweet at us, send us a direct tweet. Our Twitter handle is @Canada Institute, all one word. So while those questions come in, I wanted to do a round of questions and really just talk about the party leaders. There's a lot of focus on the leaders, and there were interesting performances. And since no one got what they wanted, the question I have for everyone is, what does that mean for the various party leaders? And Daryl Dexter, I want to turn to you first, maybe not because it's from your region, but because you have deep roots in the NDP. How do you think Jagmeet Singh is doing, and what do you think his prospects are within the party now that the election is over?
Yeah, I'm not expecting the party really to take this performance out on him. The reality is that nobody got what they wanted. So he wasn't special in that respect. Everybody kind of ended up where they were. For Jagmeet, it was his second. Election, and I think. One of the great assets that he has is just his likability. People very much like him, young people in particular. Every poll that came out said the same thing, that he was by far the most likable of the federal leaders. It just hasn't translated yet. And the comparison that I was drawing earlier with some other folks was, if you look at Jack Layton, who was the lead, not the previous leader, but the one before that, Jack was also a person who had a high likability factor as well. People often refer to him as the leader that most people would like to have a beer with. But Jack Layton ran 4 elections, and it did not translate for him until his last election. So it takes a while for that as an asset to be crystallized, along with the right set of policies to be able to translate. And I think the party will essentially say, this was a wash for us, and we'll get ready and for the next election, whenever that will be. And Jagmeet's kind of a pragmatic guy in many respects. He'll look how to use his position as a potential minority partner to be able to push on things like a national pharmacare program, to push on the childcare question, and a push very much on affordable housing questions, or just affordability generally. And I think all of those particular issues appeal very much to his base.
I'm a little too old for this, but I have it on very good authority from younger people that he's very big on TikTok.
Yes, very much so, and that's it all showed up in the polling numbers. With young people, he overperformed dramatically compared to the others.
Frédéric Gagnon, you have the distinction of being in the province from which more leaders came than any other. And so I'd ask you broadly about, first, Yves-François Blanchet at the Bloc. How did you think he performed? I also want to ask you about Maxime Bernier and his performance in Quebec. Trudeau himself from French Canada, and so many the debates, there were questions about his performance there. And then last but not least, François Legault, the premier, weighed in at one point suggesting Aaron O'Toole in a minority government might be the best choice. How do you think that affected Aaron O'Toole, and will it affect his outcomes? What's your sense of the leadership from there?
I'm going to start with Yves-François Blanchet, maybe the leader of the Bloc Québécois. There are experts of Quebec elections, Canadian elections, who followed this campaign way much than I did. Daniel Bélan at McGill, or Stéphanie Chouinard that you talked to on election night, Chris. And so what I'm going to say is pretty much things that they said during the campaign also. But Yves-François Blanchet, of course, wanted more seats. That's pretty much what he said during the last stretch of the campaign, because there was a question that was asked at the English debate that captured the attention of Francophones in Quebec, a question about provincial laws adopted in the province of Quebec regarding visible minorities and also the protection of French language in the province of Quebec. And the moderator at the English debate talked about racism in Quebec and the fact that the laws maybe were discriminatory to minorities. And Yves-François Blanchet kind of rolled his eyes at the debate. And after that, he used this issue to try to gather more votes for the Bloc Québécois. And so François Blanchet thought he had a momentum after that. At some point, the Bloc Québécois thought they would be able to win maybe 40 seats in the province, but they got 34. So it's not what they expected, but it's still 2 more seats than what they had gotten in 2019. Justin Trudeau won his election pretty easily in the district of Papineau. He remains extremely popular in the district, which is my district. So we saw him at the metro station the day after the election. He always does that, shaking hands, and he's very popular in the district. But I think my colleagues will probably say that he launched the election because he wanted a trophy, a majority government, and he didn't get that. So it's kind of a disappointment for the Liberal Party as well. And you mentioned François Legault. Daryl said nobody got what they wanted in this election, and François Legault, the Premier of Quebec, said at some point, there are parties that want to centralize power in the hands of the federal government on issues like immigration, healthcare, and it's not good for the autonomy of the province of Quebec. So therefore, maybe the Conservative party is the option this time. With a minority government, maybe, but they're the party that cares more about the autonomy of Quebec. But again, the discussion this week, at least in Quebec, among the political parties at the provincial level, was that François Legault maybe lost his election too. And now there's an election, a provincial election in Quebec in a year also. So François Legault will have to keep negotiating deals with the federal government and with Justin Trudeau on immigration, healthcare, and it'll be interesting to see how things go, because Justin Trudeau heard François Legault saying, that maybe his party was not the best option for the province of Quebec. So that's going to be interesting to watch as well.
Excellent, fascinating indeed. Monique Smith, you're in Ontario. That's where all the votes are. But in terms of party leaders, Justin Trudeau, the Liberal leader, Erin O'Toole, clearly both trying to appeal to Ontario, Annamie Paul, who was there running in Ontario. How do you think the leaders came out, and what do you think their future might be after this? No, you're still muted. Oh.
There we go. We go back to nobody got what they wanted. But I would say, Justin Trudeau came out the same, actually a little bit better than some people were predicting by the last week. So in the end, as somebody said in their commentating on election night, it all depends on where you're looking from. If you were looking from the beginning of the campaign, when he was looking for a majority, he didn't do well. If you were looking from midway through the campaign, where he looked like he was losing even a minority, he pulled it together and he did fine. He has, I don't know that he's got another election in him. But he's got 2 years to leave his legacy. So hopefully he'll use that time to make a move on some of the big policies that he's talked about, like daycare and climate change. And I would say the Liberals are probably looking at a leadership in a year, 18 months to try and get ready for the next round. I think Erin O'Toole is on the bubble for sure, because the Conservatives have a very clear history of eating their own when they're not happy with them, and there's a good faction that aren't happy with him. So he took a few gambles. He moved to the left. He was fighting for 905. He positioned himself as a 905 candidate, a central Toronto, just outside of Toronto candidate. And the gamble didn't pay off. So he's going to have some explaining to do. And there's certainly he also offended a lot of Conservatives by reminiscing about the Mulroney years and actually bringing Prime Minister Mulroney out of retirement for an event, and completely whitewashing over the Harper years and really ignoring and offending a lot of Conservatives who are still Harper followers. So you run a big risk when you kind of engage in that kind of internal politics, especially during a campaign. Jagmeet is actually from Ontario. It's hard to know where he's from, but he was an elected member in Ontario's legislature, and he was the deputy leader of the Ontario NDP party. But I think he is fine. They will give him another chance. As Daryl said, he's a popular, likable guy, and everything didn't coalesce in this election for him, but I think he's got room to grow. And I think the NDP will give him that room to grow. Annamie Paul, who is the Green Party leader, as I noted in my opening, came in fourth in her own riding. Her time is up. The Green Party has a whole lot of soul searching to do to figure out how they come together again, because coming out of the last leadership, there was clearly a huge breach within the party that never got fixed, that never got resolved. And so now they're back to square one. So I would just like to add to what Frédéric said on Yves-François Blanchet, because I think that he was actually waning in the first part of the campaign. I think that the Bloc had a little bit more momentum going in, and his performance in the French debates, and I speak French, so I got to watch them in real time. He came across, to me anyway, as quite arrogant, and I think to a number of viewers in Quebec. And so I don't know that he distinguished himself in the French debates, but ironically found his issue in the English debate out of a question that offended him and the populace of Quebec. So, and was able to kind of turn things around and rally back from what I think was looking like more losses for the Bloc about mid-campaign. So those are my views on the leaders. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thank you. And Lauren, when we get to central Canada, when we get to Manitoba, right before the election, there was the somewhat dramatic resignation of the Premier, Brian Pallister, and a race to replace him. That's all going on in the backdrop in the Conservative Party. And of course, Manitoba is almost a bellwether, a kind of a middle of the country, all the parties play. How do you think the leaders are looking from Manitobans' perspective or from the prairies?
Yeah, so, as you mentioned, Premier Pallister did resign a few weeks ago, and the PCs here are going to be selecting their new leader on October 30th. And, despite Premier Pallister's political stripe of being conservative, he actually had a relatively amicable relationship with Trudeau and the Trudeau government. He was very selective in the fights that he picked with the feds. And, of all the prairie provinces, he was probably the most well-liked by Justin Trudeau. So, one thing to watch for is as Manitoba gets their new premier on October 30th, will they be able to forge that kind of relationship with Trudeau and play, a bit of that bridge builder from the east to Western Canada? And, it will be a bit of a historic moment in Manitoba. Currently, the two individuals vying for leader of the progressives are women. Further to the comments of O'Toole, the future is really unknown. Like has been mentioned, he lost the election despite running a centrist campaign to attract those progressives in Ontario. And I made the comments earlier about some of those potentially swing ridings in Winnipeg that were conservative under the Harper government, but has stayed liberal under a Trudeau government. And, there's already a movement within the Conservative Party to dump O'Toole, and this be to leadership race, pandemic and a snap election, O'Toole wasn't really able to establish himself with undecided voters. As it looks in Manitoba, I've already made some comments about the PPC party. And, I think a lot of that is very dependent on what COVID looks like by the time we have another election. But with O'Toole really bringing the Conservative Party more center, he did alienate a lot of the true conservative base in rural Manitoba. So, I think it's a question mark right now what his future holds, whether the PPC can make further grounds with capitalizing on that and really trying to show themselves to be kind of like the Reform Party of the 1990s. I see that, if they're able to establish themselves within that realm, then they could make some gains, which will be a problem for O'Toole.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. And Randy Pettipa, Alberta has been grumpy, if you don't mind my saying, I think in the last round, and there's some grumpiness at Jason Kenney, who, like Brian Pallister's a former federal conservative. What's your sense of, if I can ask you to go both ways, what's your sense of the future of some of the leaders now at the national level, and what do you think is happening with Premier Kenney?
Well, that's kind of the question I hoped you wouldn't ask, Chris, but I'll take a shot at it. I think Premier Kenney's in a tough spot, obviously. He has a COVID crisis on his hands. He's asked for the Canadian military to come in and help move patients to, jurisdictions will probably be Ontario, as ICUs are filling up. That was the right thing to do, though. And I think that if you're reading the news today or following on social media, and it may be over now, but there was a caucus meeting this morning. I think that was, his future as leader was going to be somewhat dependent on what came out of that meeting. So it is really tough to predict, but he's having a rough go right now, but to think that he doesn't know how to maneuver within a party system and how to organize and how to survive would be a mistake. And I think that he's, assuming he is not deciding himself that he would like to go, he is the premier. and I think that he will set his own timing if he can. And all indications now are that he, you know, as I'm saying this, there might be an announcement happening I'm not aware of, but all indications now are that he plans to stay and is not going to kind of get pushed around. He does get squeezed. If I can make one comment on the position he's in on COVID, and look, no one is arguing that it was handled really well, but to be fair, he had people on both sides. He had people who were saying he was doing way too much, that there shouldn't be any restrictions. He had people on the other side saying that he needed to do more. So he was in somewhat of a unique position as Canadian premiers go, I think, in that partly his numbers of being so low on handling of the pandemic, where he had a balance of views that were tough to manage. On the federal leaders, and let me talk just briefly on federal provincial relationships on the prairies. As Lauren said, you know, Pallister probably had the best relationship of the three premiers on the prairies, and I think it's fair to say that Jason Kenney had the worst. And nothing is going to make that better right now. Part of the final days of the campaign where, you know, Trudeau stopped almost running against O'Toole and he ran against Kenney for a little while. He had the deputy leader, Chrystia Freeland, spending time in Edmonton, basically attacking Jason Kenney, not really Aaron O'Toole at that point. So I think that that doesn't make for a really warm relationship as things move forward. But while we're talking about the Prime Minister, I agree with Monique's view, and it's with no particular insight from me, but I do think that, you know, it's probably an 18 to 24 month period. But I would say that he's the Prime Minister, he has sticks and he has carrots, and there's a discipline that comes with having that role. So he gets to leave more under his own steam. You know, parties rarely throw out someone that is in power. And I think that despite some of the blowback, if you talk to a lot of Liberals who are out on the ground organizing through the campaign, at the doors they were hearing, well, you know, I'm kind of fed up with Justin Trudeau. I'm fed up with Justin Trudeau, but I'm going to vote Liberal, or I like my local candidate, or I don't. But I think that there was certainly a pushback on the ground. And then you always get the, you know, will he survive? Even if he wins, will he survive? When you win, you tend to survive. And I think he will, he'll go under his own steam. But I do agree with Monique that it's probably not 4 years from now. It's more like 2. On Aaron O'Toole, I just want to, just as a reminder, when political parties lose an election, they look at the leader. And, you know, I agree, the NDP will do that, and probably they're going to say, well, Jagmeet Singh's our guy and he did as well as could be done, so we'll stick with that. But I think that it just needs to be remembered that it's not out of the ordinary when a party has lost an election to say, do we have the right leader? And the Conservative Party is doing that now. And that's not pleasant if you're the leader. Quite often, if you're in the either Conservative or Liberal Party, it doesn't work out very well for you when you've lost, and that is happening. But I do think it's worth making the point that it's not out of the ordinary to have a look at leadership as you come out of an election that you haven't been successful in.
And Randy, can I ask you a little bit about Chrystia Freeland? Obviously, one of the members of the cabinet had a little bit more name recognition south of the border here in the United States.
Yeah.
What's your sense? After the last election, the 2019 election, there was some noise around her as being, you know, the sort of outreach person to the West, that she was going to be handling intergovernmental affairs, and then she ended up in finance. You know, is she someone who has an ability to help the Liberal government build some bridges to Alberta? Obviously not Jason Kenney. Or do you think that that's a little bit of a media creation in the East, and that she doesn't anymore seem like a Westerner to people out there?
No, Chris, I would argue that she does have some credibility in Alberta. You know, she was born and raised in Alberta. Her parents still live in Alberta, and I think that she definitely has credibility. Her relationship with the Premier at one point was quite good, and you know, I venture to say that it's not as good as it once was. But I do think that she's someone that can at least kind of get a call returned, and I think is viewed as very credible. And she spent time in Alberta during the campaign, and campaigns are campaigns, but I do think that if the Kenney government needed to pick a Liberal minister they were going to deal with, in the absence of there being Alberta ministers, which that's going to change as well, but she's as well liked as any Liberal minister is. The other reality is, she went from being essentially the chief operating officer of the government of Canada to being both the chief operating officer and the CFO. So no one kind of questions the power she has within the government, and that demands respect, whether you like her or not.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. I'm going to do two things here. One, remind our viewers, if you're watching this live, that you're welcome to send in questions to canada@wilsoncenter.org by email, or you can send us a question on Twitter, Canada Institute. That's our Twitter handle, and we can get your questions in. The second thing is I'm going to pivot a little bit as I go to Ted Alden, because I've been wondering whether you can say that there's a COVID effect here. Obviously, we're all experiencing COVID. There's the border restrictions. There are also restrictions, I think, led some people to take advantage of mail-in ballots at a greater percentage. What do you think the COVID effect is in this particular election? And how would you compare it to the 2020 election, in which Americans were dealing with a COVID effect of their own?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very significant, and I think COVID will continue to dominate elections until it begins to fade more significantly. And there are no epidemiologists here. We don't know what's going to happen next. But I think that was the biggest thing that Erin O'Toole wasn't able to overcome. I mean, the Liberals tried to paint him as sympathetic to the anti-vax movement. I think he was reluctant to go too far in a pro-vaccine direction because he was worried about the People's Party on his right flank. And so I don't think there's any question that's probably the biggest issue that hindered his shift to the left, and explains, as Monique pointed out, why he didn't take more of the 905 area votes, why he didn't take more of the suburban votes out in British Columbia. I do think there's some interesting parallels in the United States. I mean, Canada and the United States are very different political entities, and what happens in one doesn't necessarily spill over into the other. But you've seen Joe Biden here wrestling, I think, with exactly this question: how hard to push on vaccines and a vaccine mandate. His government was very reluctant. Jeff Zients, who runs a pandemic policy for the White House, was saying, no, this is not a good way for the president to go. We're going to alienate a lot of independent voters who may support vaccines but want it to be a matter of personal choice. And of course, President Biden a couple of weeks ago announced a much broader vaccine mandate for governments and for large businesses. I think the decision to require vaccines for international travelers was another big move in that direction. I think it will happen at the land border, though for the moment, the U.S. doesn't quite have the institutional infrastructure to do that. But I think that's going to be the defining issue here in the midterms and quite possibly the next presidential election. So I think for the foreseeable future, COVID is still king, unfortunately for all of us.
Yeah, unfortunately. Premier Dexter, I'm bringing back to you in a similar way, because during the campaign or in the run-up to the campaign, people pointed to Ian Rankin, the then Premier of Nova Scotia, who called an election and took a position we expected Trudeau to take as well, which is it's not great, but I'm managing the pandemic, and just send me back because there's a lot of work to do, kind of a serious approach. And it didn't work for Ian Rankin. What do you think of the COVID effect and how people in Atlantic Canada are reacting? And why wasn't Ian Rankin's loss a perfect precursor for a Trudeau loss? What did they do differently? And did Trudeau maybe take a trick and then adjust his strategy accordingly?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because in Nova Scotia, it wasn't really a COVID election. And I would argue, what happened was that, in fact, the numbers were very, very low. And they have been low relative to the rest of the country. Atlantic Canada has generally been, I won't say completely unscathed, but certainly not affected the way that the rest of the country has. And when the election in Nova Scotia got underway, the numbers were very, very low, and we were moving back towards kind of full opening, no more restrictions, all of that. So for many people, it seemed like the question was not who's going to manage the rest of this crisis, but it was who's going to manage after the crisis, like who's got the recovery plan, who is going to move the province forward. And as you know, that's a much different question. It doesn't mean that people will rally around the leader the same way. And famously, Winston Churchill, managed throughout the Second World War, and then 3 months after the end of the war, lost the election, right? Because people wanted something different, kind of post-crisis. So. And I really think that at the beginning of the campaign, there was some sense of that. And we had this discussion before about whether or not this was going to be a COVID campaign or a post-COVID campaign. But I think very quickly as the campaign went on, it became very clear that this was not over, and specifically in Alberta and the West, and to a bigger extent in the kind of urban areas like Toronto and Vancouver, like all of a sudden this crisis was real again. So I don't think there was a complete parallel between what happened in Nova Scotia and what happened in the rest of the country. And in fact, the way that the Liberal campaign developed, by the end, the ballot question was, who do you trust to get us through to the end of this pandemic? That wasn't really the ballot question they were framing up at the beginning. The ballot question at the beginning they seemed to be moving toward was more around, was more around how are you going, who do you trust, or who do you think is best to, set the country up for recovery. And they were talking a lot about kind of post-pandemic plans around childcare and other issues. But it became clear that this was the sweet spot for the Prime Minister, was this: who do you trust to finish the job on the pandemic?
Excellent. Thank you for that. Frédéric, in Quebec, how is COVID playing? And do you think it had an effect on the way Quebecers viewed not only the federal election, but also, because the provinces are responsible for actually delivering healthcare, how does it affect the position of the Premier, a populist, but somebody who's had been early on more popular than many premiers for his handling of COVID?
Yeah, François Legault has been popular on this issue, and his health minister, Christian Dubé, also, they give press conferences on a regular basis, just like we see in other provinces. But the vaccination rate is pretty good in Quebec. The number of cases is lower than in other provinces right now, though it was high few months ago. But all in all, François Legault has been popular on this issue. If you look at polls, public opinion polls on issues that matter to Canadians this time, you see variations among provinces, of course. There was an Angus Reid poll that was conducted at the end of August, and COVID-19 was the fourth most important issue for people in Quebec, for voters in Quebec. After climate change, improving healthcare access, though healthcare access is linked to COVID-19, of course, and taxes. And in other provinces, BC, climate change was first. Ontario, climate change was first, and in other provinces, priorities were different. In Alberta, at the end of August, COVID-19 was not among the five more important issues, but I'm sure that right now it's one of the most important issues, of course. If you compare the situation of this election in Canada with the election in 2020 in the United States, I don't know what my colleagues think, but I don't feel that for most voters, this election was a referendum on the performance of Trudeau on COVID-19, like it was in the US. For many voters, it was a referendum on how Donald Trump had handled COVID-19. I don't feel that there was only one issue that was the star that everybody followed in Canada. And as a result, you saw that depending on the day, depending on the week, people were kind of focusing on different issues. Sometimes it was COVID-19, sometimes it was provincial laws in Quebec that I referred to earlier, et cetera, a sentence that was said on the campaign trail. So, but COVID-19 was there. And if I could conclude with that, I think it maybe it had an impact for two other reasons. Maybe for many voters, the fact that Trudeau launched the election at this time of our history led many to think maybe that Ottawa has bigger fish to fry. They should focus on the issues, focus on managing, fighting against COVID-19 instead of spending many weeks on the campaign trail. And maybe this had an impact, COVID-19 had an impact on turnout. It'll be interesting to see if maybe people stayed at home because they feared to get sick, just like you had this debate in the US in 2020, to get sick when going to the polls. I'm not sure there was a direct impact, but maybe our research will show that it explains in part, at least, the low turnout that we saw this week.
Excellent, thank you for that. And Monique, coming to you in Ontario, I wonder a little bit about that argument that was sort of had around the election, that yes, Justin Trudeau wanted to have an election to try to win a majority. He was facing an untested conservative leader and so forth. But the reason for a majority, people would say, well, you have to have a majority because you have to do big things. And yet it seemed as though he was able to get enough support from the opposition to continue the CERB, to fight COVID well, to handle infrastructure. Like what he wanted, he was able to get by opposition votes. So it didn't really seem like there was a price that he paid for a minority that would justify, in a time of national emergency, let's have a majority. How do you think those issues played in Ontario, or from your observation elsewhere? Was the case that a majority was necessary undermined by the cooperation of leaders and parties in the face of the crisis, or?
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, I think Daryl referred to it at the beginning that, the question was raised in the very beginning, why now? And he was never able to answer it. And so that became an issue. And that's why people are defining it as the election about nothing, because no one could figure out what the issue was, because he couldn't define why he wanted the election now. And I think that's part of the reason why he didn't get his majority, is because there was no answer to that question. As far as the impact of COVID on the election, I think there's a couple of things at play in Ontario. There were 1 million mail-in ballots across the country, which is more than we've seen in a long time, and which is why we've got places like Winnipeg and a few places in Ontario where some poor people are still living on tenterhooks wondering if they've won or lost. It's not going to have an impact on the overall numbers. I mean, it's going to be a Liberal minority. It's just tweaking around the edges. But for those people, it's their lives. Having been an elected official, I know what it's like on election night, let alone dragging it out for a couple of days. And as Americans know, Chris and Ted, you'll know, and some of the viewers will know, dragging it out for a week almost killed all of us last year. So the mail-in piece is important. In Ontario, we had logistical problems. We had districts where they went from 120 polling stations to 30. So all of a sudden you had the same number of people trying to vote in 30 places as normally would be going to 120 places. The argument was made that they were larger places and able to accommodate distancing, et cetera, but we had huge lineups in a few districts, and we had people waiting in line 2 hours, 3 hours. We had people voting, at almost midnight in some districts in Ontario. So that the logistics around that were a problem. I think people were trying to figure out where to vote and how to vote strategically more than they ever have in the past, strategically in the sense of timing and location. So in my district, which is 11 small municipalities up in Northern Ontario, the argument was go to the advanced polls because there won't be the lineups. It'll be easier. In fact, a lot of people bought that message and went to the advanced polls and stood in line for an hour, where, I walked into my small town Legion on Monday afternoon at 2, and there was just me and the ladies running the polls. So, I think, but, people were kind of gaming it more than they normally would, given that the number of polling stations had been reduced, given that the lineups were being monitored, with 6 feet distance, all of that. So there was fear of the disease, getting the disease. There was fear of having to stand in line forever. And then there was just the logistics too around, if you've been voting at the same place for 30 years in downtown Toronto, and suddenly your polling stations move to not just 3 blocks away, but 2 kilometers away, it's a big change. So that I think had some impact in some ridings across the province, and I think overall it was certainly a worry that people were carrying into the polls, and the fact that the Prime Minister could not answer the question why now, I think annoyed a lot of people, and gave a lot of fodder to the journalists to talk about.
Well, we wouldn't want the journalists not to have stuff to talk about. Let me follow up on that in a particular way, because there's a lot of debate among political scientists about strategic voting, but there was certainly the sense in a lot of provinces, and certainly I mentioned this with Premier Dexter in Nova Scotia, that and also in Quebec with François Legault, this idea that voters are shopping and comparing. You know, that they have in Ontario, Doug Ford on the provincial level, who's a different party than the Prime Minister, and both sides trying to make sure, you know, if Justin Trudeau didn't deliver the money that Doug Ford needed, then he had an issue he could bash the federal government with. If Justin Trudeau wasn't seen as concerned about the issues that Doug Ford thought were, he would go back and forth. Do you think there's a shop and compare in which Justin Trudeau came out maybe a little bit more appealing than Doug Ford that helped him, even if people were still mad that the election seemed to be about nothing? Do you think that comparison helped Trudeau, or do you think that it was something that may ultimately help Doug Ford when he goes up for election next year?
I think people are wondering if Doug Ford's still our premier, because he's been missing in action for about 3.5 weeks. I don't even know what he looks like anymore. So, and that was a strategic move. I mean, that was, his popularity is low, keep him underground, don't get in O'Toole's way. And so it's hard to make that analysis around Trudeau and Doug Ford, because there was no Trudeau and Doug Ford. I mean, he literally disappeared from the planet for almost the entire election. I would say, though, that, and I meant to mention this earlier on the COVID impacts, I would say that the Conservatives were in better shape until things started to go sideways in Alberta. And Jason Kenney was so well identified as aligned with O'Toole that actually brought the Tories' numbers down across the country. Like, I don't think that was just an impact in Alberta. I think there was a general association between Kenney and O'Toole and the situation in Alberta that hurt O'Toole nationally. But as far as whether or not Ford would be hurting Trudeau, it really was amazing how silent Ford was. It was amazing that he managed to stay silent the entire time.
I don't want to know what they did to him. I just it'd be nice to see him back. Let me go to you, Lauren. In the prairies, you don't get as many visits. There isn't quite as much going on. The candidates all go where the votes are rich. And that was something that was raised also on the question of First Nations. And going into this election, there was a lot of concern because of the discovery around residential schools of Indigenous kids in mass graves. It's just, I don't know how else to say that. It's just that awful. And I know a lot of Canadians were quite shocked by that as well. And then you've heard from some Indigenous communities mad. Kamloops, I think, saw Jagmeet Singh, but before the election call, and nobody during the election call. What's your sense of how the relationship between Indigenous communities, the First Nations communities, and the rest of Canada has played out, and that feeling that you actually referenced in one of your early talks about being ignored and not being the center of attention leads voters to kind of react to, you know, being sort of lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, there's a riding in Manitoba up north that represents a lot of the remote fly-in First Nations communities. And that is currently held by a new Democratic Party, Nikki Ashton. And so that was one that the Liberals really did focus on in northern Manitoba. There's a few chiefs that came out in support of the Liberal candidate who was Indigenous, part of that one of those First Nations communities. And so hoping to tap into that. Trudeau has made a lot of promises on reconciliation, on things like drinking water, which has been a huge problem, and a lot of that hasn't come to fruition. And I think that's what we saw up in the northern Manitoba riding, was the Liberals just couldn't make that gains because they haven't followed through on some of those promises. You know, Manitoba has been a bit unique. Premier Pallister had a very poor relationship with the Indigenous leaders in Manitoba that probably led to his early resignation. So, you know, provincially and federally, the provinces are really going to have to look at building those relationships, focusing on reconciliation. And Trudeau has a tough job ahead of him to try to make those promises.
Thanks for that. And I don't mean to put you on the spot on Indigenous issues, but I know Perry Bellegarde's, who's the leader of the Assembly First Nations, is your next door neighbor in Saskatchewan. You know, do those issues play regionally? Do people think about them? I know the federal government has a responsibility for Indigenous issues, but do they play with the wider population in places like Winnipeg and rural Manitoba as being important to see leaders addressing those issues, or is it just a really tough problem that doesn't really translate into politics except as a desire to see some action or see some reconciliation?
I'd say certainly a little bit in the city of Winnipeg. You know, as I'd mentioned with Premier Pallister, and one of the reasons why he resigned probably a bit sooner than expected was because of his comments on Indigenous reconciliation that happened in August. So you certainly see that. You know, whether that translated into the federal election, COVID was just such a dominant election issue that really not much else got talked about. You know, not in the city of Winnipeg and in rural Manitoba. Up north, a little bit different, as I already spoke to. But, you know, we really didn't hear on the campaign trail here provincially.
Oh, thank you very much for that. Now, Randy, I mentioned earlier on my advisory board, and I don't want anybody to think I'm going to be especially kid-gloved with you. I keep asking you the really tough questions, and I'm going to ask you another tough question, and that is a little bit about the politics around energy and climate change. The Prime Minister is very much identified on climate change, brought in the last mandate, you know, a carbon tax wherever there wasn't a local carbon price. He's been trying to push for, made sure that USMCA allowed for border adjustment fees if there wasn't a carbon price paid. In Joe Biden, there was the feeling this was someone who shared that view. But on energy, Canada's relations have been tough. Keystone Pipeline canceled, Line 5 still in limbo, and now we're hearing some environmental groups saying, let's postpone the Glasgow COP26 talks because not enough developing countries are gonna play. Now, I know this is a thorny issue, but one that plays very strongly in the Alberta patch, and we've had debates about Energy East or Trans Mountain coming from Alberta and trying to get to the sea and be part of a global energy trade. Those issues got very much overshadowed during the election, but where do you think they stand? And with the re-election of a minority government led by Justin Trudeau at the federal level, do you think there's a room for some reconciliation on the energy environment issue, or do you think we're set for at least a couple of years of a standoff between those interests and maybe some tension?
I think we're set where we are, Chris. Even though it's a minority government, it's supported by parties that would not disagree really with the Prime Minister, with the government's position on those issues. So I don't think that I wouldn't argue you're going to see a lot of change coming on that. Interestingly, I think that within the oil patch, I don't want to speak for the oil patch, but you know, I both live and work in downtown Calgary. I think that there is more and more of an acceptance of, you know, this is the way it is. And yes, you have varying factions within the industry, as you would within any sector. But I think increasingly you do have an acceptance, and in some corners, more than acceptance. Almost embracing is too strong a word, but trying to get out in front of it and be part of the conversation and part of the solution. So. But the short answer is no, I don't see big change coming on the positions that have been taken. If there were anything, I think both the NDP and probably the Bloc would want stronger positions taken on the climate change and environment front than Justin Trudeau has done. So, you know, I hope I'm answering your question, but the answer is no.
Well, you're at least hoping you answer the question by offering us no hope on some of these energy questions, which is fair enough. I was going to ask also about two projects going west. So Prime Minister Trudeau notably stepped in to take over the TMX, the Trans Mountain Pipeline project. And there have been various discussions of perhaps the federal government will give an equity stake to Indigenous groups, First Nations groups. That might be a way to move forward. It has been moving forward despite the COVID pandemic. And there's the Coastal GasLink to take LNG potentially to Asia Pacific markets. And the timing of global markets is such that there may be actually some windows opening up for doing contracts in Asia for LNG in the near term. On those kind of projects, where do you think the politics are? And do you think we'll see those go, despite various protests, to conclusion? Or do you think we're going to see more standoffs and attempts to block those particular lines now that we have a relatively weak federal government, a federal government that's a minority anyway?
I think you're going to see some standoffs from interested parties, whether that be in some cases Indigenous, if not in all, that's for sure. You have Indigenous communities on both sides of the issue. You're going to see some standoff for environmental community and others. I don't, and Ted may have a comment on this, but I don't think you're going to see a huge pushback from Premier Horgan on either. On Trans Mountain, I think he's kind of accepted this is what's happening, and I'm not going to embrace it, but I'm not going to get in the way of it. And Ted, I think it's fair to say that on LNG, he's basically embraced at least having some LNG, and was very front and center on the LNG Canada, on the Shell project. So I think that no, those projects, I don't think you're going to see. You're going to see opposition on the ground to them, but I think they'll, things will continue to move ahead. But if are there going to be new projects? I think the answer to that is no. But and again, I'm not speaking for the industry, but as an observer of it, I don't know that that's all about governing and politics. I think that's about the demand, and is there a need for the product? Is there a need to move the product? Keeping in mind that when you're making those kinds of decisions, you're not talking about what's going to happen in the next 5 years. You're talking about what's going to happen in the next 30 or 40 years. And so I think that is going to limit some of the new project outside of potentially LNG, but that's going to limit new projects more than the politics of the day.
Absolutely. And thank you for that, Randy. And Randy set Ted Alden up perfectly. Ted, what's your sense from the other side of the mountains there?
Yeah, I mean, I would by and large agree. I mean, of course, Premier Hogan had opposed the Trans Mountain Pipeline, but at the end of the day, it was challenged through the Canadian courts, and those challenges lost. I mean, there is a tradition of direct action out here in British Columbia. You've got it up Vancouver Island right now, over a large grove of old growth forest up near Port Renfrew, and I mean, full disclosure, I was kind of indirectly involved in some of that myself back when I was younger, having to do with forest practices in British Columbia. But I think at the end of the day, direct action needs to be supplemented by legal action of some sort or another. I mean, the courts are the place that environmentalists and Indigenous groups and others who oppose these projects have and can win their victories. But in the case of Trans Mountain, that was unsuccessful. And so I think there could well be some further small skirmishes of one sort or another, as Randy put it. But I think that's going ahead. I think the premiers recognize it. I think Jagmeet Singh recognized it in the campaign, really had very little to say about it, even when he was asked quite directly about it during the English language debate. I haven't followed the Coastal GasLink quite as closely, but there you don't have the provincial government opposing it the way you did with Trans Mountain, which seemed to me to make Trans Mountain, if you had to pick which project was more likely to be blocked, it would have been TMX, and it wasn't. So I agree with Randy's judgment on that.
Well, I'm going to use you as my pivot again, Ted. It's just because you're American, or you're in the States, so I have to pick on you.
And I'm American, yeah.
There was, I know in one of your many past lives, you were a journalist. You wrote for the Financial Times and other papers. And one of the things that we had in the 2020 election in the United States was debate about fake news and social media, and to the extent that they were stoking wild rumors about vaccinations or about COVID, or even spreading news about candidates and that sort of thing. And that's been with us for a couple of cycles. Looking at this election, at least from my point of view, I didn't really see Canadians worried about integrity of elections, hacking coming in and changing results. I also didn't hear a huge debate about fake news or misinformation. Is it because the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans and the Iranians think Canada is too small a target, so they don't start interfering, or is there a more rational debate? What do you think accounts for the fact that that just wasn't an issue there, but it was so much of an issue in our elections in 2020?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think in some ways we failed to hit the top line here, which is the fact that the Canadian election was so boring is a good thing, right? I mean, here in the United States, in terms of the future of our democracy, boring would be great, right? I mean, we've had the opposite of boring, dangerous and insurrectionist and all the other things we can talk about. I am not sure I have a good explanation for the Canada-US differences on that front. I think there's a great PhD dissertation in there somewhere, but Canadians do not seem to have gone nearly as far down these rabbit holes as Americans have. And the same social media is accessible to Canadians, right? There's Facebook and all of the other platforms that people can get lost in and buy, a lot of these conspiracy theories. I think it was an anti-vax article that was the best read thing on Facebook last year. And there's, of course, a lot of controversy here in the United States about trying to get these platforms to monitor content more effectively. But you saw very little of that in Canada. I don't know if Canadians are generally more sensible. I think the short duration of the elections is a good thing. I mean, we live here in the United States under perpetual elections, which I think are not a great thing for governing. I think in Canada you have a more appropriate balance, which is mostly what governments do is govern. And then for a period of time, the election takes front and center. Obviously, there are political calculations in everything a government does. But here in the United States, we have this kind of permanent election environment. And I think, that it has encouraged everything to be viewed through a partisan lens. I mean, I admit I'm still astonished by a lot of what happens in American politics, despite having lived in DC and covered it closely for 20 years. The notion that an anti-vaccine movement would become the political center of the Republican Party, having covered, the George Bush administration and having worked with Republicans at the Council on Foreign Relations, I never would have guessed that. So it's strange times here, and I'm pleased to see that Canadians seem to be less susceptible to that.
Well, it's often said about Canada and the United States that we have the same things, same trends, same movements, but we always take it a bit too far in the U.S. That's our brand. Premier Dexter, how do those issues play in Atlantic Canada, where the media environment has gotten very thin on the ground, the newspapers are getting thinner all the time? How are people reacting to this whole fake news and some of the rumors about vaccinations and so on and so forth? And do you think there was a general confidence in the integrity of the election, or maybe some doubts in some quarters?
No, I think generally speaking, people didn't really see an issue with the so-called fake news that you saw in the U.S. I mean, there was the one instance with Chrystia Freeland, posting a video on Twitter, which was flagged as manipulative media. But other than that, there was really kind of, no thought that was going on. No real. No real questions that went beyond that. I think it is, just something in the nature of Atlantic Canadians. I mean, this is a place where, it's the home of the red Tory, right? I mean, this is, people who are left on social issues and right on financial and physical issues. So it's a different environment, I think, in the Atlantic Canada. It's very much like Manitoba in that it's a smaller population region. People are very much connected to each other. So, I like to think it's a little more civil. When I was before I became premier and was in the House of Assembly, I worked through 3 minority governments, and they were constructive. We worked together. we put together a list of the things we agreed on and the things we could work on and the things we could disagree on. And we worked on the first two and we left the other one till the next election. So, that was just kind of the attitude that we took. It's, really we're public servants. We're here for what's in the best interests of the people of our region. And, once you walk through the door of the House of Assembly, your job is to get things done. So, I just think that that's more of what exists still, thankfully, in Atlantic Canada. So that kind of sets us apart in some ways from the experience that you have in the United States. A lot of older people here, so you do get a lot of Facebook, but it's more the Facebook marketplace where people are swapping things.
and along with Monique, I know you're a veteran, somebody who's stood for office, and I've often felt that there's something about the fact that you face your opponent in the assembly directly. Canadian politics rarely has that sense that the person on the other side is the epitome of evil in the modern world. Wrong, perhaps, but not evil. Did you find that, or maybe that's just something from Nova Scotia, but it strikes me as all Canadians, they definitely disagree, but they don't necessarily talk good versus evil in the same way we do here. I don't know. What do you think, Premier Dexter? Oh, I muted you.
I think that's very much the case. And I think Alberta, and Randy would be better to comment on this than I am, but I thought that during Rachel Notley's time as premiers, things started to degenerate a little in terms of the way that she was treated sometimes by not only members of the opposition, but kind of larger partisans outside of the House of Assembly itself. And there was a number of examples of that over the time that she was in government there. But I think generally in Canada, there, like as you say, we disagree. Try not to be too disagreeable, that's I hope we're able to maintain that kind of a culture. Of course, social media, unfortunately, tends to push people down the rabbit holes of the extreme, because so much is just kind of classified as opinion. And even if it gets flagged, by the time it gets flagged, it's been posted and reposted. So, yeah, I think that's one of the main differences.
Thank you very much, Premier. Frédéric, how is the Francophone media? Did you have some of the same debates in Francophone media about fake news or rumors spreading on vaccines, or has the Francophone media been similar to what we've heard described in other parts of Canada?
Well, we have media who pay a lot of attention to that with programs on misinformation, disinformation. At Radio-Canada, we have a program called Les Décrypteurs, so they fact check pretty much not everything that's on the social media, because you cannot watch everything, but they try to inform the population in French about the risks of disinformation and fake news. And I was curious to see what would be the results of this election in particular, because Monique said a few words about the PPC, and Maxime Bernier has tried to emulate some of the strategies you see from some Republican candidates in the US. If you look at his platform, he was talking about the fact that the government violates individual liberties of Canadians with proof of vaccination, obligation to get vaccinated. And I saw that at some point during the campaign, he flirted with arguments that you heard in the States during 2020, saying, we should have volunteers watching how elections go at the polls, just to make sure that the process is going to be okay. But it seems like this kind of discourse and these ideas didn't gain a lot of traction in Canada. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's political culture. Maybe it's the fact, as Premier Dexter said, that we are less polarized than the United States, that Canada is less polarized than the United States. But it's going to be interesting to see if this party with another leader in the future gains more traction. Because if you look at the results of 19, you see that I think Maxime Bernier and his party had 1.6% of the vote nationally, and this time it was a little more than 5%, if I'm not making a mistake here. But you saw polls during the election that predicted that maybe the party would get to 8% and 10%. That didn't happen this time, but I think there's some appetite for ideas that you hear from the anti-vax movements in the United States. You saw protests during some events in this campaign. Justin Trudeau got some gravel. Some groups threw gravel at him at some event. It was marginal, but I think we have to pay attention to that because there's some of that on this side of the border too. Is it going to disappear after COVID-19? Is COVID-19 and the debate on vaccine driving pretty much this movement? Is it temporary? I'm not sure about that. I don't know, but it's going to be interesting to see.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I'm reminded of two things. One, we have an audience question, and the second is that we're running very close to time. So what I'm going to do is a bit of a speed round for Monique, Lauren, Randy, and Ted, if you want to jump in. On the question of mail-in ballots, our viewer is asking, was Canada really ready for so many mail-in ballots? Some questions about whether the right names were printed on the piece of paper, how they were communicated back and forth to people. This was a system that had never been used at this level in Canada before. So what did you think of the experiment with mail-in ballots, starting with Monique? And if there's anything else you want to add as we wrap up, please go right ahead. You can have a free answer your own question and ask it too. Monique.
Great. On mail-in ballots, I think there was expectation that it was going to be much higher. They were saying like we could be up to 5 million ballots cast. There was only 1 million. I can only say that my friend in London, England, didn't get her ballot until they tried to courier it to her this week, but she couldn't have couriered it back in time. And I tried to do an online ballot request and never got any response. So I'm not sure that the number that were actually cast is reflective of the number of interest in it. I think there may have been some flaws in the system. And I would just say on social media, I think, even if you look at the People's Party website, it's much tamer than what you would see in America. And even though, we say they're kind of our Trumpites, it's true. A much more polite approach. And just anecdotally, I think that Jagmeet Singh's incursion into the youth vote, into the youth mindset, into being where they're at is hugely important for the future. And I can tell you anecdotally, my niece who's 18 was going to vote NDP because he cared about the environment. And then she figured out that if she voted NDP, he wasn't going to win, but O'Toole could win. So she strategically decided to vote Liberal. I had nothing to do with this education on strategic voting. She had to see it on TikTok. So I'm just saying social media is working in various mysterious ways across the country.
If I can add just one thing on this, if
please.
I can. He also had an island in a video game called Animal Crossings, like Joe Biden did in 2020. So that was interesting also, trying to reach out to the younger voters out there through video games as well.
This is a sign that I'm not the youth vote because I only understand about 2% of what you just said. Lauren, over to you.
Yeah, sure. I think Monique covered about the mail-ins. That's certainly what we saw here in Manitoba as well. Not nearly what they were expecting. Certainly experienced, as I mentioned, that one riding that we're waiting on and counting mail-ins. I think they're on box 4 of 7, and it's been two days of mail-in counts. So it's definitely, it takes a long time. So I think that they're probably very happy that they didn't get the number of mail-ins that they were expecting, just from a logistical and those candidates waiting to find out what their lives are going to hold. I just wanted to briefly touch on the vaccine issue here in Manitoba. So as I had mentioned, the People's Party of Canada took a good chunk from one riding in southern Manitoba, and it ended up being about 2% of all the votes that the PPC got in Canada. So very highly concentrated in this riding. However, Manitoba has about an 85% vaccination rate. It's quite high. It's one of the highest across the country. And so this movement is really occurring in a couple very kind of small targeted ridings. So what will be interesting to see is as Saskatchewan and Alberta start implementing their vaccine certificates or proof of vaccination to do certain things, if some of that movement on social media and some of that misinformation continues to spread. So, we're certainly seeing it in those couple communities in Manitoba. And, small towns, you get a lot of groupthink. And, when a direction kind of blows one way, then that movement starts growing, which is certainly what we saw with the People's Party of Canada in that one riding. So, I think that's it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Over to you, Randy.
I'll be very quick, Chris. Number one, I think that both Lauren and Nick covered the mail-in ballots. The only thing I would add to that is, yes, there's been some bumps in the road on that, and Nick mentioned the long lineups. But I think Elections Canada, though, as an organization, is kind of above reproach in terms of making it work. Everyone gets to vote, and I don't think there's a question of the validity of those votes. On the freebie, that I can just throw anything out, Chris. The one comment I would make on minority government is in Canada, in the last 7 federal elections have resulted in 5 minority governments. We've only had 2 majorities, one Harper, one Trudeau. So it begs the question moving forward, is this something we're going to have to get used to, and our party's just going to have to learn to align differently and work together to govern the country?
Important word to the wise. Thank you, Randy. And last word to you, Ted Alden.
I appreciate that out west. Not much to add on mail-in balloting. It works well here in Washington State. I think, one of the problems in the U.S. election system is that it's handled state by state. And so, my son got his Canadian ballot on election day and read it and said it has to be back in Ottawa by election day. So he didn't get his vote in time. So I think there's some wrinkles to work out on the mail-in balloting, but you've got a national Elections Canada handling in there. I think that'll be resolved. And my freebie is I'm going to steal back Jagmeet Singh from Monique and claim him for British Columbia, where he rightfully belongs, in Burnaby, where he was reelected. My daughter would not forgive me. She's one of these enthusiastic Canadian young Canadian supporters of Jagmeet. So I do think he's got a lot of upside down the road, but he's definitely, when he becomes Prime Minister, he's a British Columbian.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank all of you on behalf of the Canada Institute and our viewers. This has been a really deep discussion, actually, talking about a lot of dimensions of an election. We said at the beginning it was an election about nothing, that produced a result that was nothing, and yet we spent 90 minutes having a very interesting discussion of what it revealed about Canadians and the Canadian mood, and that's all down to you. So very big thanks to Daryl Dexter, to Frédéric Gagnon, to Monique Smith, Lauren Stone, Randy Pettipa, and Ted Alden. And thanks to our viewers for tuning in to this broadcast on the Canadian election, 44th general election. What happened? Here from the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Goodbye, thank you, and please come back again soon.